Hey guys, welcome back to yet another YouTube video where today we're going to be testing out quite an old camera. I'm not sure if you guys have heard of it, but today we're going to be testing out my dad's old Canon 1000D. This camera was released back in 2008 and was sort of the early days of Canon's entry-level budget DSLR cameras. And you might be thinking, Harry, why are you bothering using this camera? You have two full-frame DSLRs that are way better, and you also have a cinema camera. Well, the fact is that this camera only costs £60. My dad bought it when it was new back in 2008. But however, if you look at the price currently on eBay and mpb.com, it goes for around £60, and the lens that I'm using with it is the EF 50mm f1.8 STM lens, which goes for around 75 to 100. Hence why this video will be titled the £130 camera challenge. I went out for a walk the other day, just went around taking some shots and seeing how this camera performs. But before we get into the photos that I've taken, I just want to run through some specs quickly. So this camera was released in 2008. It has a 10 megapixel sensor. The sensor size is APS-C, obviously, being in Canon's budget entry-level lineup. So it has a 1.5 times crop on any lens you put on here. So this 50mm lens becomes somewhere in the region of 70mm. It takes a rather old Canon LPE5 battery. It shoots RAW, obviously, which is great. Has 7 autofocus points and has 1 SD card slot. The menu systems are quite archaic. They're very primitive, and it definitely shows how old this camera is. But you don't really need a good menu system to take good photos, so that's not really a downside. It's just not pleasing in terms of user experience, I think. Now, when I picked this camera up to go and shoot with it, I was actually really pleasantly surprised at how small this thing is. It's so tiny, which is such a welcome surprise and change from coming from sort of the cinema camera rig that I've been using recently, and my 5D and my 6D, both with battery grips. They can get quite cumbersome and heavy, so it was really nice just to walk around with this sort of little dinky baby camera and not be bogged down by the weight of a full-frame DSLR with a battery grip. Something that I didn't like was the fact that the viewfinder is pretty small. I like having a bright, big viewfinder to look through, so it's just easier for composing my shots and knowing when I've nailed the focus. But I think with the size and the price point of this camera, that's not something you can really complain about. But yeah, that's just something that annoyed me a little bit. Something that I do like about this camera, which is also one of the reasons why I like the 5D Mark I, is the fact that the button layout is very easy to use. It's very simplistic as well. It does have live view, but it kind of reminds me of the 5D because there's no bells and whistles. There's nothing amazing about it. It's just pure photography, which is great because for me as a photographer, it makes me think more about my composition and what I'm actually taking photos of, which is really cool. And usually when I have that sort of experience with a camera, I get more good usable shots. The fact that it only has one SD card slot doesn't really bother me. I've never owned a camera with 2 SD card slots, so I've never known any different. The battery life was also good. I didn't shoot with it for long enough to know how long it lasted, but I was pleasantly surprised by the fact that it didn't run out too quickly. But then again, it is a Canon camera. It doesn't actually have to do much or power anything sort of extravagant, so I am expecting it to last quite a while. One mistake that I did make whilst I was out taking these photos is the fact that I didn't change the file size. So when my dad shoots with this camera, he always shoots in JPEG. Unfortunately, I forgot to take it off JPEG, so all of these photos are JPEGs. So I haven't actually tried out this camera in RAW. But that being said, I was really quite pleasantly surprised with how much I could pull and push the files, even though they're JPEG. In Lightroom, I managed to push and pull them quite as much as I do with my 5D and my 6D, but however in some areas they did start to show signs of color banding and not being able to resist the amount of editing that I usually do with my stills. I think because I took them in JPEG, if you're really pixel peeping and looking for errors, you can look quite closely and see that some of the details in these images do get sort of mushy and muddy, and the sensor definitely doesn't have the amount of crisp detail that something like my 5D and my 6D does. But that being said, I did shoot in JPEG, so the true quality of this camera is probably a little bit better than the JPEGs that I've been pushing and pulling, but I wouldn't expect this camera to have the same amount of quality and detail as something like my 6D. I'm just editing this video and I realised I completely forgot to talk about the ISO performance of the camera. It goes from 100 to 1600 and can't be boosted above or below, but I really wouldn't recommend going anywhere above ISO 800 if you want the full image quality that is capable from this sensor. Because noise does start to creep in anywhere after 1000, especially at 1250 and even more so at 1600. So if you want the best quality images from this camera, do keep to those lower ISOs. You can't really expect this camera to be that much of a low light monster. It did only come out in 2008, it's only APS-C, and they only cost currently £60 on eBay and mpb.com, but nevertheless it's still good. I didn't try out any other lenses on this camera just because I wanted to keep this setup as it is, because the different lenses I try, obviously the more expensive the setup gets. My dad does have an 18-55 kit lens, but I try to stay as far away from those as possible because, especially with his, the quality is absolutely terrible. He's had his since 2008, so it is quite beaten up and the quality is just really muddy and awful. So I decided to stick with the 50, and I was pleasantly surprised by the quality of this setup. It just goes to show that your setup isn't always everything, and what you're taking photos of and how you deal with them in post is really sort of one of the most important factors. The gear you have doesn't actually get you that far, it's what you do with it, your photographic or artistic eye, if that makes sense, and how you again, like I said, how you handle your images in post. I also tried out more of a panoramic slash cinematic crop with this camera, which probably isn't recommended because it only has 10 megapixels, and the more you crop, the more detail you're losing, so I wouldn't recommend doing that. But that being said, the images did come out quite nice, definitely usable for Instagram and social media. I wouldn't look at using them for prints, but if you're not cropping too much and you're using some nice glass, I think you can definitely use this for some sort of small size print, maybe in a photo book or on a card, or just getting some 6x4 prints. But yeah, this camera is definitely usable, and especially if you have a nice set of EF glass, you can definitely make use of this camera. And I think the small size is something that really draws me to it. So next time I go on sort of a long trip and I need just like a small camera to take photos with, nothing too bulky, nothing too professional looking, so that I don't get stopped, I think I may take this, just because I know that even in shooting JPEG I can get some nice pictures out of it. So that's probably one of the positives that I can take from the mistake of only shooting JPEG. So I know that if I shot in RAW with this camera, I could probably pull even more detail from the sensor and get some even nicer shots, because I feel like a lot of the time when people take photos, people who don't know a lot about photography won't ask, oh, do you take this with a 1000D? They're not, people who don't know a lot about cameras aren't going to turn their nose up at you just because you use a certain camera. It's all about what you shoot and what you do with the camera you've got, not which camera you've got, if that makes sense. Okay, so that has been it for this week's video, guys. Thank you so much if you have stuck around for this long. I decided not to do a Q&A for this week because I've been super busy and bogged down with uni work and other personal projects. But next week it will be returning, so do keep your eye out for that on Instagram if you do follow me. If you don't follow me, go and follow me at harry.cr2. I'll put the link in the description. Until next week, I've been Harry.